All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tasha Davenport, CASBO CEO. Thank you for joining us for this conversation around transportation, the legislative outlook. The conversation today will be led by our Transportation Professional Council Chair, Carlos Chicos. Thanks for joining us, along with our governmental relations team here at CASBO. As we kind of settle into the conversation today, I first want to welcome your comments and your thoughts and your input as we have this amazing opportunity and probably also a responsibility to help shape, legislation and the like for our current careers, but also for generations to come. It's hard to unwind law. So we want to make sure that it's sound and effective as we go into it, and we're always interested in providing that feedback to make it such. So again, just understand that we are looking for your input. We welcome that input. It helps shape the conversations that we have across the street behind me here in Sacramento. We are also wanting to let you know that we are recording the session today. We will be sending both the recording as well as the presentation out after the session. So if you have any questions as we go along, please enter those into the chat. And as we get natural breaks in the conversation, we will be addressing those questions. So welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to Carlos for the robust conversation on transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. I'm glad that there's a few of you guys here joined this morning, and I think we're going to have a pretty good discussion on some of the things that are coming up in as far as legislation is concerned. Just a brief introduction. I'm the Executive Director of Maintenance Operations and Transportation for Capistrano Unified down here in South Orange County. I just want to give a shout out and kudos to CASBO and their team. Elizabeth's work is always so much appreciated. We can pretty much continue doing our work and not have to worry about these things. But it's so nice that they reach out and try to get our feedback from professionals throughout the state, so that we not only have some forewarning about what may be coming, but also, they're listening to us so they can make sure that our interests are heard. So and I'd like to allow Elizabeth to say something so we can start out with her comments as well.
Yes, thank you. As it was mentioned, thank you for taking some time out of your day today. We really wanted to provide this opportunity to let you know what legislation is being proposed and introduced this legislative session that impacts the work that you do on an everyday basis. And so the goal here is really to have a discussion around what are these bills, what do they do, what's the impact it's going to have on you and your LEA, but really get that feedback from you. We're in this moment of time right now where we have opportunities to continue having conversations and discussions with the author's office and or sponsors, should there be. Actually, both of these two bills that we'll be discussing do have sponsors. And we can have conversations with the committee consultants too. Where we are right now in the legislative process is that bills already got out of their House of Origin. So the Senate bills got out of the Senate and are moving over to the Assembly. The Assembly bills got out of the Assembly floor and are now on the Senate side. And so they're going to be referred over to the respective policy committees, which is going to be the education committees. And those, we have that moment and opportunity in time right now to have conversations with the committee consultants as well, to provide any sort of recommendations, any concerns, any ideas and thoughts, so that can be taken into consideration as they're writing their committee analysis, which really helps provide insight to the rest of the committees and the rest of the memberships within the committee. So please, any thoughts, input, feedback, go ahead and incorporate in the chat. This is why we want to have this conversation with you all. And with that, we can go ahead and get started. Our first bill that we're going to be talking about is AB 579 by Assemblymember Ting, who also happens to be the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. This has to do with zero emission vehicles. If this sounds familiar, it probably is, because Assemblymember Ting had a similar bill, almost identical to this last year, AB 2731, that CASBO also had taken an opposed position on, citing numerous concerns. And so what this bill does is it would beginning January 1st, 2035, require all newly purchased or contracted school buses of an LEA to be zero emission vehicles. The difference between last year's bill and this year's bill is that it has this thing where it says where feasible. And so that's a different type of clause that we're seeing in this proposal. And what it's trying to say is that an LEA can determine that that's not feasible for them to be able to have zero emission vehicles. They would be able to request a one-time extension that would not to exceed 5 years, but they would need to meet the following 2 criteria. And that would be to reasonably, and there's no definition for reasonably, demonstrate that a daily planned bus route for transporting students cannot be serviced through available zero emission technology in 2035. And then it also says that the State Air Resources Board, along with the State Energy Resources Conservation and Development Commission, they would then need to receive that information and evaluate that LEA's request. So it would be upon their determination on whether or not you would get this one-time extension. So CASBO does have an opposed position on this. In terms of the fiscal impact, the Assembly Appropriations Committee estimated that this would cost about $5 billion over time. And as a reminder, in last year's Budget Act of 2022, the governor and the legislature decided to approve $1.5 billion in Proposition 98 funding specifically for zero emission school buses. And as we see that funding, that is not anywhere close to being able to cover the $5 billion that is being estimated by the legislature themselves. And so that is a big concern. Now, yes, we see that $1.5 billion, however, it's going to cost $5 billion to transition over. And then to that point too, given that we are in different economic revenues than we were last year, the legislature is deciding as part of their action plan for the budget to shift that type of funding over the next couple of years. And so we don't know if that 1.5 billion in Prop 98 will continue to be there when this bill, should it pass and get signed, to be implemented. And so that continues to be a really big concern. Another thing that I wanted to incorporate here too is that the author's office is talking about additional amendments specifically to frontier school districts. So they have heard from a number of school districts that are expressing concerns around the feasibility and the terrain and the route constraints. And so the author's office did mention that they are going to be amending the bill to give frontier school districts an additional extension that could apply for up to 5 more years. So then that would go from 2040 to 2045. And so frontier school specifically mean that you meet either one of the following conditions, and that's a total number of students in ADA at all schools served by a school district that is fewer than 600, or each county in which a school operated by the school district is located has a total population density fewer than 10 persons per square mile. And so they are looking at the most rural areas, school districts, to provide them with an additional 5-year extension, giving them essentially a 10-year extension on this. As much as I can appreciate that there's consideration for an additional extension, I don't think it really addresses the concerns that we have when it comes to just how operable some of these, or non-operable some of these zero emission buses that we currently see, and the challenges that we're continuing to experience with them. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carlos to provide a few words.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. And I think you were spot on. The concerns I think are totally understood. You know, and not that we're opposed to moving forward to cleaner energy, right? We're all on board with that. It's just it's a funding question, and until I see a bill that's parallel, you know, to what it requests, and there's parallel funding that's being offered, I think that we have to take this type of position. And it's always a little concerning when you see a mandate like this, and it's kind of a broad brush approach to the entire state of California. So many districts and such, we vary in not only our topography and geography, but even in a district like Capistrano that is pretty urban, because our district is so large, we have concerns when it comes to the distance an electric school bus will be able to cover with a lot of our particularly special needs routes. So in that sense, yes, I think it falls short to be able to address those issues. And speaking of the extensions, you know, we can keep extending and keep extending if there are concerns, but if the funding still isn't there, that's needed. And I think 5 billion is pretty conservative. Actually, I think it's probably going to be more than that when you consider over time how this infrastructure, while in some cases maybe the charging infrastructure and the buses will start to get more competitive in their pricing. You know, we saw what inflation does to all prices. So what are we going to be? Where are we going to be at 11 years from now? It's probably going to be significantly higher. So with all those things considered, I think an opposition stance is a reasonable stance for this type of mandate.
Yeah, and the conversation really with our legislative committee from last year and this year has to do with what about the infrastructure? I mean, there are grants right now and there are opportunities for LEAs to have zero emission type of buses, and they're taking advantage of those opportunities. But again, this is an unfunded mandate that would be created statewide. And so some of the concerns that have been brought up so far with some of these buses are just, you know, the cost of it themselves, the difference between $450,000 for an electric bus versus a diesel vehicle, which is roughly around $250,000. The charging infrastructure, again, we're still seeing that need. There's a need to continue to build that up. There's concerns around the batteries and what type of heat and temperature wherever you live, how that can be an issue for being able to charge or not charge your battery. So for example, in areas where the temperature reaches 115 to 118 degrees, there's battery problems that take place. So that's something that is also needing to be considered. I'm hearing stories about when there needs to be a maintenance fix for the bus and how the closest area or location is about 4 hours away. You know, if a bus doesn't just stop working and they have to tow it and it has to go, I don't know how many more miles to the nearest location, it can take about 4 to 6 months in order for it to get fixed. And so really, again, to your point, Carlos, it's not that we have issues with trying to transition over to the zero emissions. The infrastructure is not there yet, the funding isn't there yet, and we need these buses to really be able to transport students in rural areas where even the Bay Area, we're hearing that the hours for the bus and the traffic that takes place and just not enough time. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to improve some of these buses so that we can transport our students accordingly. But any other information, thoughts, feedback when it comes to infrastructure, charging, maintenance, cost, really want to hear from all of you. So any information that you'd want to incorporate or provide, please feel free to do so in the chat. Any other thoughts on this, Carlos?
No, I think you said it well. you know, and I've heard from many of my counterparts that have purchased, you know, electric buses, and yeah, with some routes they do okay, but unfortunately we're seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of 65% range, you know, when you compare it to what the promise was, right, from the manufacturer. So in cases like that, if we try to replace those buses with what we, you know, with our either gas vehicles, CNG or diesel, we're going to be in a world of hurt if that's the case. So we have to make sure the technology catches up all the way before we even start to entertain this type of mandate.
And then to be fully transparent too, we had some of our members meet with the governor's office last year on this. Again, Assemblymember Ting, he's the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. And so it was almost a given that the bill was going to get out, that was going to get to the governor's office, because there was funding available at that moment in time. So we got a head start, had a conversation with the governor's office, expressed to them these concerns. And for them, they said, well, it's not until 2035. And so why are you, it was more of, if we have this now, then we should expect to have this done by 2035, even though the infrastructure is not there. But from their perspective, they want to see that happen and have a time frame, because if we just don't have a time frame, we just continue to wait, it's not going to happen. And so we know that climate is really important to the governor, and their thought was, hey, let's just have something in place now so that we can continue to work towards that and have a goal in mind. But for us, we just had to remind them that, you know, that we can have that goal and we can have that in mind, but the infrastructure is still not there. So let's build that infrastructure first before creating an unfunded mandate on this. But to our surprise, the bill did get held in the Senate Appropriations Committee and did not move forward last year, which is why we're seeing this bill being reintroduced. Again, not really sure where it's going to land in terms of the funding, but that's definitely going to need to be a conversation with the Appropriations Committee in the Senate. So we're going to be talking with them as well. Oh, and then just another thing too that came to mind as we're talking about the concerns here is, what about those school districts that are in like the wildfire areas? Are they experience power shutoffs, and how are they supposed to charge electric buses in those situations? And a handful of these districts that are in these areas are also considered evacuation spaces for when things like that do take place. So just another thing that I wanted to point out in terms of the concerns and the challenges with this bill. So the next one we're going to be talking about is SB 88 by Senator Skinner. That has to do with driver qualifications. As you know, Senator Skinner was the champion behind providing the home to school transportation reimbursement last year. So I know after so many years of trying to fight for additional home to school transportation, we finally were able to see it. So that was as tricky as it started with the legislation being introduced last year. We're really grateful that nothing to the formula changed, but rather there was an increase in the reimbursement. No, it doesn't come to par with the current costs, but we're just happy to see some additional funding after so many years. And so this bill would impose new requirements on drivers who provide transportation services to students, including background checks and requiring the drivers to be mandated reporters. It also mandates all vehicles used for student transportation for compensation by LEAs to be inspected and equipped with a first aid kit and a fire extinguisher. CASBO has taken an opposed position on this, not necessarily because we want to compromise the safety of the students, but just the additional new requirements are a little bit excessive when it comes to providing some sort of flexibilities that LEAs need in order to transport students, whether it be, a last minute teacher or coach that needs to take students or athletes to a game or to a practice. There's just a handful of different concerns. I'll go a little bit further into this, but also providing on here what the fiscal impact is. So the Appropriations Committee in the Senate estimated that it could different challenges here when it comes to shifting to drivers, the completion of medical exams, drug and alcohol testing. So all of that would be taken into consideration for how this would how much this would cost for LEAs. And then they can also incur additional costs so that the drivers meet the new qualification requirements, such as verifying the background checks and providing the training for mandated reporter. So it's on pretty much the accountability aspect of it that would increase the cost to the LEAs. So on the next slide, I won't go over it all, but essentially these are what LEAs are currently having to do when it comes to providing background checks. And so that's just to put into perspective everything that has to be done. And then on the next slide, just some additional things the bill does. It requires a driver who provides transportation services in a vehicle with a capacity of more than 10 students, including the driver, to hold a commercial driver's license for the appropriate class vehicle, and then to comply with the previous section that we just showed if they don't already have to. It requires an LEA that's contracting with a private entity that provides transportation services for students to obtain from them a written attestation to the specified conditions. So it's making sure that here's what the requirements are. If you're contracting out with a private entity, you have to ensure that they're complying with those conditions. And it requires any vehicle used to provide student transportation for compensation by an LEA to meet inspection requirements and be equipped with a first aid kit and fire extinguisher. And so those are some of the additional requirements within SB 88. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carlos.
So this is an interesting one. You know, at first glance, I was happy that there was a bill like this that was moving forward. I think Nancy's intent is commendable, but there are some problems with the language. You know, I think what's trying to be addressed here is some of the alternative forms of transportations that districts have just been forced to use, particularly because of driver shortage. Some school districts don't have their own fleet, so they're looking to provide transportation services however they can. In doing so, there is a gap in California that I think she's trying to close, which I think is a good thing, because some of the providers that districts have contracted with fall really short when it comes to do with some of the requirements. So again, as Elizabeth mentioned, I'm all for background checks. I'm all for having a fire extinguisher and a first aid kit on those vehicles that are not, you know, commercial vehicles. I do think there should be some training too for these drivers, and drug and alcohol testing should be something that's happening with these drivers, and they should be following some sort of pattern that's at least similar to what a school bus driver has to do. Where there's some problems with the bill is that the requirements go so far as to require pretty much the same that we require of a school bus driver when it comes to a commercial driver's license. So I know some school districts operate a white fleet, and they have licensed drivers, and obviously those they are in a drug pool. They are obviously they have to do a physical test before they're employed. They have to pass a background check, but to ask those drivers to be commercially licensed is excessive. So and hopefully there's some amendments to this, or it comes forward with a little bit different language, so that we can close that gap and we can make sure that students that are transported by any contracted provider are safe, right? Because we always, in our industry, we always remember, and we have it, we're always thinking about it. Ed Code 44808. Districts are free of liability once kids leave the school property unless they're being transported. So we want to make sure that the providers that we're using to transport those kids meet certain requirements. We're going to find ourselves in a pretty litigious situation if something happens on a contractor provider that falls extremely short of what we're providing other students on a school bus. So she's attempted to address that here, but it needs to be cleaned up a little bit, and then I think maybe we can revisit it. But as it stands now, I think you have to oppose it because it just doesn't make sense. I think maybe they're looking at some, and I think Elizabeth is going to be able to speak to some of the amendments that are potentially going to move forward that haven't yet. But short of that, I think we have to take the stance.
Yeah, and just a overview and recap of the conversation that was had in terms of the concerns and the challenges with this bill is, again, the LEA is being now involved with making sure that the criteria is being met for the other drivers and conducting the background checks, the administrative considerations that need to be taken into consideration to do the background checks, to verify the driving records, and ensure that the drivers have the appropriate licenses and certifications. So that's just something to keep in mind when it comes to just the safety equipment. LEAs will need to make sure that they have a procedure in place so that they can provide regular inspections and maintenance and restocking of the equipment that is being asked to be provided in here, like the first aid kit and the fire extinguisher. To your point, Carlos, too, the training, compliance and training, making sure that LEAs could have some sort of established protocol and procedures in place so that we know that there is compliance happening with these requirements. And then, yeah, when it comes to liability and insurance, that's something to be considered as well. How would it help or not help to have these additional safeguards and rails being applied to private entities? What kind of impact would this have on your liability and insurance? So thank you for raising all of those things. When it comes to the conversations that are being had, I think some other examples that have been brought forward by other organizations and our membership too is, again, being able to provide some sort of stipend for parents who are providing transportation services. So they would be subject to these driver qualifications as the bill is currently written right now. In those conversations with the sponsors of the bill, we have made that a concern, and it doesn't seem like it is their intent to capture parents as part of this. And so I don't know exactly to what extent the author will be taking amendments or what those amendments are going to look like just yet. But conversations are happening around the exemptions for coaches and teachers and perhaps any other school employee. They do want to try to help. It does sound like there is an appetite to provide flexibility on transportation when it comes to field trips, sporting events, or just other type of extracurricular activities. Again, that clarification on the parent drivers, we want to ensure that they're not being captured under these circumstances. Revisions to the initial training requirements, clarifying only home to school transportation and not transport to behavioral and other required appointments. And so as the bill is written right now, there is a lot of concerns around whether someone, let's say like a foster student is receiving certain services. And so through whatever support and guidance they're getting on the county behavioral center side, that they would be then subject because they're transporting students as well. And there's concerns around that. When it comes to students that I would say are more on the served by the county offices of education are most at Promise Youth. There's some additional services that are needed through other agencies and other programs. And so that has been a topic of conversation as well when it comes to them having to be subject to these requirements. And so we do see that there are organizations like CASA in different parts of California that have also taken an opposed position for those specific purposes. So again, the bill is currently written as written. There are continued conversations around what potential amendments could look like, and that's where we stand right now on this.
I think there was something in the chat, Elizabeth, from Lee. Can we are we able to shed some light on the traction we feel this bill is getting? As recent as the CASBO conference seemed that bill had some legs to a pro lobby from CASTO and CDE and a local provider who intends on meeting these requirements. So, I mean, I couldn't speak to the traction. I know that there was some discussion at CASBO conference, and I do know that CASTO is in favor of this bill. That being said, speaking to some of the CASTO leadership, they also have concerns about some of the language within the bill. So they're also hopeful for some amendments. As far as CDE, I haven't heard anything specifically. I don't know if you have, Elizabeth.
No, I haven't. But you're right. CASTO and we have an overlap of some of our membership here. They are in support of the bill. Yeah, no, I haven't heard anything from CDE, and it does. I would say the bill does have some legs, and it's been able to get out of the Senate fairly easy. It's being very much perceived as a safety bill, and so we know that it'll continue to get through the legislative process, and that's why it's really important that if we see a bill that has a lot of traction, that has a lot of leg, it is being authored by Senator Skinner, who has a big influential role in the legislature. And so we take these bills very seriously, which is why we want to provide some input and some feedback and some recommendations, so that should the bill get to the governor and should he sign it, that it'll be feasible on the LEA side to be able to meet these requirements.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully that's what happens if it continues to go through. And I don't know that any individual provider would actually be in favor of particularly some of the requirements, because it would completely get everybody out of the game as far as an alternative provider. Especially when you consider the commercial driver license requirements. This is what kind of allows those alternative providers to exist, because they're usually utilizing sedan vehicles and not commercial drivers. Their cost would be exorbitant if those requirements would come to fruition. So we'll see. We're just going to have to wait and see what comes down the pipe as far as some amendments are concerned.
Yeah. So any thoughts, feedback, input that you have that you want to share, please let us know. We're in the middle of the legislative process, so there's still opportunities to continue seeing some changes on this. Okay. And then this one, CASBO didn't take a formal position on this, but thought it would be good to share that this bill SB 775 would authorize LEAs using electric school buses to add signage to the bus identifying it as an air electric bus. It would authorize CHP to develop appropriate regulations. The fiscal impact from the appropriations committee is estimated to be about $50,000 to $100,000. That CHP pretty much said it would be a one-time cost to develop these appropriate regulations for these purposes. So again, this is just a bill that would authorize school districts to be able to do this, putting it on your radar because it's flying through, most likely will get to the governor and get signed. And then wanted to also move on to let you all know that in these legislative workshops and webinars that we're doing, we want to make sure that you all are getting information in regards to what is happening when it comes to education, finance, and in the budget. And so we have 3 bills that we just wanted to highlight for your reference. And the first one is AB 721 by Assemblymember Valencia. This essentially focuses on county offices of education, and it would allow them to publish district budget meeting notices either on a website, newspaper, or both. Currently, they're required to do it in a newspaper. We're hearing it's an outdated statute. Why do they have to continue to publish via the newspaper outside of the initial roughly $300 cost for every newspaper that they have to publish? It does take additional administrative staff time. This bill is being seen as, well, what we, instead of just doing it through the newspaper, can we do it through the website? Let's provide additional transparency by allowing more accessibility through the website. But again, you'll be able to do it either the website, newspaper, or both. So providing that option and that flexibility. And you don't see this very often, but the Appropriations Committee and the Assembly actually said that this could be a cost savings. Normally bills cost money, and this one is actually saying that you could save money in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The bill was set for hearing on the 7th. There's some with the Newspaper Publishers Association. So it has yet to be heard pending a new hearing date. And CASBO is supporting this one. The next one is AB 938 by Assemblymember Muratsuchi. It has to do with targeted increases to the LCFF base grant. He has been a champion of targeted aspirational goals for the LCFF in the last couple of years. We were fortunate to see that funding in last year's budget. And he has introduced this bill again, just to start having those conversations. So setting those funding target levels for 2030, 2031. The difference, and CASBO has been very supportive of increases in the aspirational targets for LCFF. Continuously been supportive of efforts like that. The difference between what has been previously done in the past and this year's bill is that it actually has intent language that references that they want to increase these base grants so that it can go towards increasing school site employee salaries. And so that's been the biggest difference, is that this one is specifically referencing an increase to 50% of salary increases for certificated and classified school site staff. We have a supportive amended position on this. Again, CASBO has always been supportive of increases to the LCFF. However, the reference to the 50% and specifically saying school site employee increasing their salaries is causes a little bit of a heartburn. The conversations around this were really how is this going to impact the bargaining at the local level and the tension that could possibly cause. So any funding that we would see come 2030, 31, there could be a lot of local tension happening around how that funding can be used. And should this bill get signed as the way it's written, there can be an argument for a reference to have that funding be directed to increase staff salaries. And the Assembly, the Appropriations Committee estimated that this would cost between $2 billion and $14 billion to double the LCFF base rates by 2030-31. So there is a big cost to this. You know, given the revenues that we're seeing right now, it's unclear where we will be in the coming years. But at least right now, again, these are aspirational targets. We want to, we're happy to see that the conversations are beginning to happen, so that when there is another opportunity to help increase the base grants, that we'd be able to do so. There were a couple of amendments that the Assembly Education, coming out of the Assembly Education Committee, which actually Assemblymember Muratsuchi is now the chair of the Assembly Education Committee. Assemblymember O'Donnell had been chairing that committee for the last several years. He decided not to seek re-election and decided that he just wanted to go back to teaching. And so Mayor Tsuchi is the chair now. This is his first year. We were really grateful to him and his staff for taking a handful of amendments that we had asked for. Specifically, we wanted clarification on whether the employee salary in the wages were going to incorporate health and benefits and pension. So really looking at compensation as a whole and not just the salaries itself. And then we were also requesting an exemption for basic aid districts, which they were able to do. We did ask for the deletion of the reference specifically to the 50%. And although most of the amendments were taken, there is one reference that was left on that 50%. So I think there was some tension or some conversation between the sponsors and the author's office to keep it remained. And so even though in the Assembly Education Committee, the author agreed to take all the committee amendments that were found in the committee analysis, specifically on pages 11 and 12, that would have deleted and removed the reference to all of the 50%, that there was a change in mind. And so again, there's just one area in the intent language that continues to reference the 50%. And then on the next bill, the last one is SB 98 by Senator Portantino. He is also very influential in the legislature, being the chair of the Assembly or the Senate Appropriations Committee. And so this bill essentially tries to change how we're being funded from ADA to enrollment based. The big concern here is that it would require that at least 30% of the funds be used to address chronic absenteeism. This bill is a reintroduction of a bill that the same bill that he had last year. There was attempts last year to get this bill moving forward and stalling. So here he is reintroducing it. We had an opposed position to the bill last year. We continue to have an opposed position this year. And it's not necessarily that we're opposed to the conversation to shift from ADA to enrollment based. It's really on this new categorical that it would create by telling you that you have to use at least 30% to address chronic absenteeism. So this is sponsored by LAUSD and a couple of other organizations, and also keeping in mind that right now ADA is on the policy side is tied to a lot of things within Proposition 98. So it's not just that easy to shift from ADA to enrollment base and you just change the funding. It's what are the policy conversations and considerations that need to be had should that transition take place. And at this point in time, CDE has estimated that this could result in about $3.6 billion each year. So there was an opportunity for this to take place last year. I don't know, and I don't anticipate this moving far along. $3.6 billion price tag on it. We just don't see the funding there. We're going to continue to oppose this. And that wraps up our presentation. Carlos, do you have any final words that you would like to say?
No, just thank everybody for joining. And if you have feedback, please send it to me, Elizabeth. We're trying to work behind the scenes to make sure that your voices are heard. I just want to reiterate a big thank you to the CASBO team for all that you do, and we'll continue to work together. We do have some PC openings. If you're interested in serving on the PC, the transportation PC, please reach out to me. We are making the process as easy as possible so that you can serve in your region. So always need to help. And we also have a transportation collaboration kind of email group. So if you are not on that list and you'd like to be added and included on that list, please email me. My email's right there. So and we'll make sure we add you to that list. And anytime there's a question or concern, any question is very much welcomed, and the group is always willing to pitch in and provide their professional counsel and advice. So I think that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.